The morning Etta Gentry rode into Callow Creek with nothing but a saddlebag, a worn Bible, and a heart full of cautious hope. The sky above the New Mexico territory burned the color of fresh embers, and every soul in that dusty little town would come to remember it as the day everything changed. It was the spring of 1882, and Callow Creek sat at the edge of a wide, flat valley ringed by red rock mesas that glowed like heated iron in the afternoon sun. The town itself was a modest collection of weathered buildings strung along a single main street: a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a barbershop on Tuesday mornings, a small schoolhouse still being finished at the eastern end of town, and the whitewashed chapel of Reverend Cyrus Hollowell, which stood at the corner of Main and Creek Road, as if planted there by God's own hand. The Reverend was a spare, serious man of 53 who had built that chapel with his own calloused palms, and who believed firmly that the Lord rewarded patience, hard labor, and the proper observance of ceremony. Etta had not come to Callow Creek looking for love. She had come looking for work. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair she kept braided and pinned beneath a sun-bleached hat, and eyes so deeply brown they looked almost black in certain light. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a seamstress and a man who could never stay in one place longer than a season. When her mother died the previous autumn of a fever that moved through the Barrio district like a cold wind, Etta had sold what little they owned, packed what she could carry, and decided that a westward horizon was as good a direction as any for a woman with nothing left to mourn in the place she was leaving. She had heard through a freighter passing through a small rail stop outside of Albuquerque that Callow Creek's schoolhouse needed a teacher. The town council had been advertising for months, apparently, but the territory's remoteness made qualified candidates scarce. Etta had enough education. Her mother had seen to that with fierce, particular devotion, and enough stubborn determination to fill 3 classrooms. She rode the last 40 miles alone on a bay mare she had traded her mother's silver brooch to acquire. The first person she spoke to in Callow Creek was Lou Dunbar, who ran the general store and served unofficially as the town's postmaster, town gossip, and informal welcoming committee, all in one round-shouldered, cheerfully curious package. Lou was a woman in her mid-40s with a head of steel-gray hair and an apron permanently dusted with flour, and she looked Etta up and down with the frank assessment of someone who had seen plenty of young women come through and few of them stay. "You the schoolteacher they sent for?" Lou asked from behind the counter. "Nobody sent for me," Etta said, setting her saddlebag down on the counter. "I came on my own account. I heard there was a position." Lou smiled at that, wide and genuine. "Well now, that's even better. Self-propelled women last longer out here. Go see Tom Briggs over at the lumber yard, he's the one who's been hounding the council about the school, and find yourself a room at Mrs. Pierce's boarding house. She won't bite, but she'll charge you in advance." Etta followed both pieces of advice. Tom Briggs, a heavy-set man with a permanent squint from years of working in open sun, hired her on the spot with a handshake that nearly rattled her teeth loose. Mrs. Pierce, a widow of 60 who smelled of lavender and determination, gave her a small but clean room overlooking the creek that gave the town its name. It was not until her 3rd day in Callow Creek that Etta Gentry met Grant Townsend. She had gone to the livery to check on her mare and arrange for longer-term boarding of the animal, and she found the place occupied by the kind of quiet industriousness that speaks of a man entirely at home in his work. Grant Townsend was 28, tall in the particular way of men who have spent years doing physical labor, and carried it with natural ease rather than deliberate display. He had dark blonde hair that curled slightly at his collar, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same sandstone as the mesas, and gray eyes that held a quality Etta would later struggle to name: not coldness, nothing like coldness, but rather a stillness, the way deep water is still, and you cannot tell from looking at the surface how deep it actually goes. He was reshoeing a gray gelding when Etta walked in, and he looked up from his work without the exaggerated attention some men gave to a woman arriving alone. He simply looked at her, the way a person looks at something they find genuinely interesting. "Miss," he said, straightening. "I have a bay mare," Etta said. "Brown patch above the left eye. I want to board her here through the school term at least, maybe longer if the position suits me." "Bay with the patch," he said, nodding. "She's been settled in the far stall since Monday, good-tempered animal. She's been eating well." He set down the hammer he'd been holding and pulled off one work glove to offer his hand. "Grant Townsend. I run the livery." "Etta Gentry," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm but careful, like a man who had learned to measure his own strength. "You're the new school teacher," he said. It was not a question. In a town of Callow Creek size, news moved at roughly the speed of light. "I am," Etta said. "Starting Monday when the building is ready." "Tom Briggs is putting the last of the benches in today," Grant said. "It'll be ready." He picked up his glove again and looked at her for a moment with that deep-water stillness. "Where'd you teach before?" "I haven't," Etta said, and lifted her chin slightly because she had found that honesty delivered with confidence was more disarming than false modesty. "But I can read and cipher, and I know history and geography, and I want to teach." "That seems like most of what's required." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. "Fair enough," he said. "Welcome to Callow Creek, Miss Gentry." She paid him for the mare's board, and as she walked back down the main street in the warm, late-morning light, she did not allow herself to think about his eyes. She had come to this town to build something for herself, and that was the whole of her intention. She taught her first day on a Monday in early April, and it nearly broke her. There were 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, and they were cheerful and curious, and absolutely certain that a new teacher was an invitation to discover the outer limits of acceptable behavior. By noon, Etta had separated 2 boys who were competing to see who could balance a piece of chalk on their nose the longest, redirected a girl named Clara Briggs, Tom's daughter, who kept trying to teach her desk neighbor the words to a song that Etta was reasonably sure had originated in the saloon, and retrieved a frog from inside the cast-iron stove, where someone had installed it during the noon break. She went home to Mrs. Pierce's boarding house that evening with her hair falling out of its pins and her boots dusty, and a scratch on her left hand from a splinter in the new bench. And she sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling and told herself firmly that she was not going to cry. She did not cry. Instead, she planned the following day with the systematic thoroughness of a military campaign, and by Wednesday she had the classroom running with a kind of cheerful, energized discipline that made even old Tom Briggs, who came to check on the building's repairs, pause in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a surprised expression on his face. The weeks built themselves around the rhythm of her work. She rose early, walked to the schoolhouse, taught all morning and part of the afternoon, and spent her evenings preparing lessons at the small table in her room at Mrs. Pierce's. On Saturdays she did her shopping and her laundry, and sometimes sat on the front porch of the boarding house with a book, watching the town move through its weekend pace. She saw Grant Townsend regularly, because in a town the size of Callow Creek you saw everyone regularly. She saw him at the general store and at Sunday services at Reverend Hollowell's chapel, and occasionally on the street in the evenings when she walked to ease the stiffness of a day spent standing at the chalkboard. They spoke the way townspeople speak, easily, about practical things, about the weather and the condition of the road east, and whether the supply wagon from Santa Fe would be delayed again. She noticed that he was quiet in a way that was not shyness. He spoke when he had something to say and listened genuinely when others spoke, which was rarer than it ought to have been. She noticed that he was kind to the children who came to the livery. Several of her students had fathers who did business there, stopping to show them how a bridle buckled or explain why a particular horse held its head differently than another. She noticed that on Sunday mornings he always sat in the second pew from the back rather than the front, and she thought that said something about a person, though she could not have said precisely what. On a Friday evening in late April, a thunderstorm rolled in off the mesas with the speed and drama that only the high desert seems capable of producing, and Etta, who had stayed late at the schoolhouse finishing a geography lesson on the board for Monday, found herself stranded as the sky went from dull orange to deep purple to howling black in what seemed like the time it took to gather her coat. She was standing at the schoolhouse door watching the rain come down in silver sheets when she heard boots on the step behind her and turned to find Grant Townsend standing under the narrow overhang with his hat dripping and his coat dark with rain, holding the reins of his own horse and the reins of her bay mare. "Thought you might need a way home," he said simply. She looked at him and then at the mare, whose patient brown eye regarded her from beneath the downpour, and felt something shift inside her chest that she chose not to examine too closely just then. "You rode out here in this," she said. "Started before it hit," he said. "I saw the light was still on when I passed an hour ago and figured you hadn't left. The road back runs low near the creek. It'll flood if this keeps up." "I know," she said, and she was annoyed to find that her voice came out softer than she'd intended. "Thank you, Grant." He held the mare steady while she mounted, and they rode back to town side by side through the storm, the thunder rolling above them like a kettle drum and the lightning turning the mesas into ghostly, spectacular things, and neither of them spoke very much, but neither of them felt the need to. When they reached Mrs. Pierce's boarding house, he took the mare's reins from her and said he would see to the animal, and she said thank you again from the porch with the rain drumming on the roof above her, and he tipped his hat and rode on toward the livery. She went inside and stood dripping in the front hall and told herself, with great conviction and a complete lack of success, that she was not falling in love with him. May came in with warm winds and longer evenings, and Callow Creek began to acquire the busy, dusty energy of a town in its working season. The cattle ranches to the south sent drovers through regularly, and the saloon did its brisk business, and the post came twice a week now instead of once, and Etta found herself becoming more thoroughly woven into the fabric of the place with each passing week. The children trusted her now, fully and without reservation, which was a thing she had not expected to affect her as deeply as it did. Clara Briggs brought her wildflowers on Tuesday mornings as a matter of established ritual. A boy named Ezra Colton, who had refused to read aloud in front of the class for the first 3 weeks, finally read 3 full sentences from a geography primer in front of everyone, and looked up at Etta afterward with an expression of such startled pride that she had to look at the ceiling for a moment to compose herself. She and Grant had taken to walking together on Sunday evenings after services, which had begun without either of them formally arranging it, and simply continued, because neither of them suggested stopping. They walked to the edge of town where the road curved north toward the mesa and back, which was perhaps a mile and a half in total, and they talked about everything and nothing. About the town's growth, about the children, about the books she was teaching from, about the horses that passed through his livery, and the stories their owners carried with them like packed luggage. She learned that he had come to Callow Creek 3 years earlier from Colorado, where he had worked briefly in the silver mines, before concluding that underground living was not for him. He had learned the livery trade from his father in Kansas, and had bought out the previous owner of the Callow Creek stable with savings accumulated over 4 years of careful, steady work. He had no family nearby, his parents were dead. A younger brother worked a ranch in Wyoming. He had built his life in this town the same way he did everything, it seemed, quietly, steadily, with attention. He learned that she had never had a proper home of her own, that she had spent her childhood in a series of rented rooms in San Antonio, following her mother's work and her father's restless absence. He learned that she had taught herself to read music by studying a hymnal she found in a church they passed every day on one particular walk, and that she could not play any instrument but could read sheet music fluently, which she considered a slightly absurd skill. He learned that she had a fierce and deeply personal faith, not the performative kind, but the quiet, load-bearing kind, and that she did not agree with everything Reverend Hollowell preached, but found the act of sitting in the chapel among the people of the town on Sunday morning to be one of the steadiest comforts she had discovered in an unsettling year. He told her things he had not told many people. She told him things she had not told anyone. The evening in late May when he kissed her was not particularly dramatic in its setup. They had stopped at the northern edge of town as they usually did, where a stand of cottonwood trees grew along the creek bank, and the sun was going down in the particular spectacular fashion that the New Mexico territory seemed to manufacture with effortless abundance, painting the sky in layered bands of copper and rose and deep violet. They had been talking about nothing of great consequence. She thought it had been about whether the new schoolhouse bench was the right height for the younger children, which was a ridiculous thing to remember as the last mundane detail before a moment that changes everything. He had turned to look at her with that deep-water quality in his gray eyes, and she had looked back, and there had been a pause that lasted the length of several heartbeats, and then he had taken her face gently in both his hands' work-roughened palms, careful as always, as if measuring his own strength, and kissed her with a quietness and a certainty that undid her completely. When he stepped back, his hands fell to his sides and he looked at her steadily. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said. "How long?" she asked, because she needed to know. "Since the day you walked into my livery and told me you'd never taught before in your complete level voice and looked me straight in the eye," he said, "which was April 3rd. I have been counting." She laughed, which she had not expected to do, and the laughter broke whatever last careful guard she had been keeping, and she stepped forward and kissed him back with considerably less reservation than his first kiss had contained, and the cottonwood leaves above them turned gold in the last light, and the creek ran bright and cold beside them, and Etta Gentry, who had come to Callow Creek looking for work and nothing else, understood with complete and unambiguous clarity that she was very much in love. June moved through Callow Creek like warm water, slow and full of light. The town felt different to Etta now, not physically, of course, but the way a familiar piece of music sounds different when you finally understand what key it's written in. She taught her classes and walked her Sunday evenings with Grant and discovered, with the accumulating dailiness of love, all the small things that made up the architecture of his character. He was stubborn when he believed he was right and honest when he discovered he was wrong. He laughed rarely but genuinely. He was kind to old Jim Pierce's, widow across the street from Mrs. Pierce's boarding house, no relation to her landlady, confusingly, an elderly woman named Me who had trouble managing her water barrel, and Grant stopped each morning to check it on his way past without ever making mention of it to anyone. Etta only knew because she saw him from her window one morning and realized the routine look of the act. This was not a new thing he was doing. She fell deeper in love with him for things like that than for anything dramatic or declarative. He brought her a book from the supply wagon in late June, a collection of poems, Longfellow, still in its binding though clearly it had traveled some distance to get there, and left it on the schoolhouse step with a note that said only, "For your shelf, since you mentioned your shelf needed populating." It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her, which might have said something about her previous history with romance, but she pressed the note between the pages of the book and kept it there. He was not a demonstrative man in public, which she understood and respected, because in a town the size of Callow Creek every demonstration was witnessed and commented on. But he was steady and present in the way that mattered more than display, and when they were alone together in the evenings by the cottonwood trees or on the front porch of Mrs. Pierce's in the late dusk, he held her hand with the particular care of someone holding something they value and intend to keep. In July, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the creek bank in the late afternoon, on a Sunday, their boots off and their feet in the cold water because the summer had turned brutal, and even the shade of the cottonwood trees felt like a kindness rather than a comfort. He had been quiet for an unusual stretch of time, and she had been watching a hawk circle over the mesa, and then he said her name in a way that made her turn. He had not produced a ring. He told her later that he did not want the ring to be a question mark. He wanted to get the question answered first and find the ring after, so that it was a certainty rather than a plea. What he did was take both her hands in his, turn to face her directly on the creek bank and say, "Etta, I want to build my life with you. I want you here in this town in my life permanently. I am asking you to marry me." She did not pretend to consider it. She had been, she realized, waiting for this question since somewhere around the middle of May, and she had her answer ready the way you have a thing ready when you have thought about it long enough that the thinking is finished. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Grant, I will marry you." He kissed her in the full afternoon light with the hawk still wheeling above them and the creek rushing cold over both their bare feet. And Lou Dunbar, who happened to be walking her old dog along the bank path, and who would later claim she had not been watching, clapped her hands together in genuine delight, and then hurried back toward the main street to share the news, because Lou Dunbar was Lou Dunbar, and some things were simply inevitable. The news moved through Callow Creek by evening with the predictability of water finding its level. By Sunday supper, every household in town had received it. By Monday morning, Etta's students arrived at the schoolhouse with the barely contained energy of children who know something the adults think is still private and are barely restraining themselves from announcing it. Clara Briggs presented the usual wildflowers with an expression of added significance. Ezra Colton, who was not a sentimental child, drew a picture of two horses standing together and left it on Etta's desk, which made her laugh and press her hand briefly over her heart. She and Grant went together to see Reverend Hollowell at the chapel on Monday evening after Etta's school day ended. Reverend Cyrus Hollowell was, as established, a serious man. He was not an unkind man. He visited the sick with genuine pastoral care, and his sermons, while long, were thoughtful and occasionally even beautiful. But he was a man of procedure. He believed that the ceremonies of life required their proper observance not because God demanded rigidity, but because human beings required anchor points, markers in time that told them what was sacred and what was permanent. He received them in the small sitting room of the parsonage behind the chapel, which smelled of old books and cedar wood and the particular dryness of desert air. And he listened, as Grant explained that they wished to be married. Reverend Hollowell asked his questions in the methodical way of a man filling in a document of importance. How long had they been acquainted? Were they both of sound mind and free will? Were there any impediments prior marriages, obligations elsewhere, matters of family objection? To each question they answered clearly and directly, and the Reverend wrote their names in his register with the careful hand of a man who believed that handwriting itself was a form of respect for the subject. And then he said, setting down his pen, "When would you like the ceremony to take place?" "The second Saturday of August," Grant said, "if that suits." The Reverend opened his calendar and looked at the date and nodded. "That is available," he said. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them both with the expression of a man about to deliver the specific terms of a contract they may not have fully read. "You understand the ceremony requires a witness, a single witness at minimum, to attest to the validity of the union." "Of course," Etta said. She had assumed as much. "In this case," the Reverend said, "I must tell you something that I hope you will understand in the spirit in which it is intended." He paused, pressing his fingertips together. "This is not a matter I raise lightly. But I have a practice, and I hold to it absolutely, that in any marriage ceremony performed under my authority, I will not proceed without the witness being present in this building before the ceremony begins. Not promised, not expected momentarily, but present. Inside this chapel, in the pew or at the door, but inside." "That seems entirely reasonable," Grant said. "I imagine it does," the Reverend said. "But I should tell you that I have had 2 marriages in recent years dissolve in what I can only call unhappy circumstances, and in each case I later discovered there had been questions, not criminal questions, but questions of character and consent, that might have been caught earlier if there had been a proper witness who knew both parties. I am an old man, and I have become perhaps overly particular. But I will not perform this marriage, not the reading of the vows, not the pronouncement, nothing, until a witness is standing in this room who can attest to knowing both of you and to their belief in the soundness and willingness of this union. Am I clear?" "Completely clear," Etta said. "Good," the Reverend said. He returned to his register. "I assume you will have no difficulty arranging a witness." "I cannot imagine we will," Grant said, with the mild confidence of a man who has lived in a town for 3 years and knows the people in it. They shook hands with Reverend Hollowell and walked out into the warm July night, and Etta tucked her hand through Grant's arm and they walked down Main Street in the late evening quiet. "Well," she said, "I suppose we need a witness." "I suppose Lou Dunbar is available," Grant said, with a slight dryness that indicated he was fully aware that Lou already knew about the engagement. Etta laughed. "I imagined she would volunteer before we finished asking," she said. They were both, as it turned out, thinking too small. August arrived with heat that shimmered off the red rock of the mesas in visible waves and made the main street of Callow Creek look like something seen through warped glass. The schoolhouse had its summer break, and Etta spent her days visiting, helping Lou at the general store when the supply wagon came in, taking long early morning rides on her mare before the heat settled in for the day. She and Grant rode together 3 mornings a week, out along the Mesa Trail where the high ground caught a breeze, and the view spread so wide it made a person feel, simultaneously, very small and very much alive. They talked about everything in those long, easy mornings. About the house Grant wanted to build on the lot he'd purchased at the north end of town, already bought, already planned, with dimensions he had drawn on paper and shown her with slightly self-conscious pride. About whether to expand the livery, which was operating at capacity and could use a second barn. About what the school would look like in 5 years if Callow Creek continued to grow the way it seemed to be growing. About the children specifically, with a directness that she found she did not mind at all about children of their own. 2, Grant said one morning, entirely without preamble as they watched the sunrise from the Mesa Trail. Or 3, enough to need a table instead of just chairs. Etta looked at him sideways. "You've been thinking about this." "I have been thinking about a great many things," he said, and the deep water quality in his eyes held something warm in it now, something that had not been there in April. "Most of them involve you." She reached across and took his hand, and they sat there on horseback with their hands joined, while the sun came fully over the mesa, and the whole valley lit up gold below them. And she thought, this is what it feels like to be entirely, specifically, correctly in the right place. The plan for the witness proceeded with what both of them considered perfectly reasonable simplicity. They would ask Lou Dunbar, who had been the first person Etta spoke to in Callow Creek, who knew them both well, and who would undoubtedly accept with wholehearted enthusiasm. They went to the general store on a Wednesday in the first week of August. Lou was behind the counter sorting through a shipment of dry goods, and she looked up at them with the expression of a woman who has been expecting this visit. "You're here about the wedding," she said. "We are," Grant said. "We'd like to ask you to be our witness at the ceremony." Lou set down the tin she was holding and pressed her hand briefly to her chest. "I am honored," she said, with a sincerity that was entirely genuine. "Absolutely honored. The second Saturday. I'll be there at sunrise if you want." "I'll be there the night before if that suits." "Saturday morning at 10 will be fine," Etta said, smiling. "Reverend Hollowell needs the witness inside the chapel before the ceremony begins. That's his one requirement." "Inside the chapel, 10 o'clock, second Saturday," Lou said, like a woman memorizing a battle plan. "Nothing in this world will stop me being there." And then on Thursday, Lou Dunbar fell off the step of her back porch chasing her dog, who had gotten into a sack of cornmeal, and broke her left ankle cleanly in 2 places. Doc Ellis, who was the nearest thing Callow Creek had to a physician, he had 2 years of medical training and 30 years of practical experience, which in the territory counted for quite a lot, set the brake and wrapped it and told Lou that she would be up and about within a month and a half if she rested it properly, and would be up and about within 3 months if she didn't. Lou told Etta, from the settee in her back room where she had been installed with her foot elevated and her dog at her feet looking either repentant or oblivious. It was difficult to tell with that dog that she was more sorry than she could express. "Don't be sorry," Etta said, and meant it. "You are to rest and heal, and that is the entire business." "But the witness," Lou said. "We'll find someone," Etta said. She told herself she meant it, and she did mostly. She told herself as she walked back up Main Street that this was a simple problem with a simple solution. Callow Creek was a town of people who cared for each other, and any number of them knew both her and Grant well enough to stand as witness. She and Grant sat on the porch of Mrs. Pierce's boarding house that evening and made a list. It was a good, solid list. They were not short of friends and neighbors. Tom Briggs was their second choice, and Tom Briggs said yes immediately and with the particular emphatic warmth of a man who felt some personal investment in Etta's welfare since he had hired her. He clasped Grant's hand and told them he would be there without fail. He meant it, genuinely and completely. On Friday, the cattle drive came through. It was a large drive, 300 head, running north from the southern ranges, and the lead drover brought his herd directly across the western edge of Tom Briggs's property without checking whether the gate was clear, because the lead drover was a man who had done things his particular way for 20 years and had not developed the habit of checking. 3 of Tom's best fence sections came down in the resulting press of hooves and cattle, and 4 of his best animals got mixed into the herd before anyone could stop it. And Tom Briggs spent the entirety of Thursday night and Friday morning engaged in the kind of terse, heated negotiation with the drive boss that required his complete personal attention, and then some. He came to find Etta on Friday afternoon with his hat in his hands, and his face red with frustration and genuine regret. "I am the sorriest man in the New Mexico territory," he told her. "I have to go with them, Miss Gentry. They've got my animals in that herd, and if I don't ride along, I'll never see them again. I'll be 3, maybe 4 days out." The wedding was the next morning. "Go," Etta said. "Go get your animals, Tom. We'll manage." She said it calmly. She walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and took 3 slow breaths and then stood up and went to find Grant. They were married in 1 day, she reminded herself. 1 day. The witness simply needed to be a person who knew them both. This was not an impossible requirement. Mrs. Pierce herself agreed to stand as witness. She was 60 years old and had lived in Callow Creek for 11 years and knew Grant Townsend as a solid, honest neighbor and Etta Gentry as the finest young woman to take a room in her house in her memory. She said yes with quiet, genuine warmth and told Etta she would wear her good blue dress. On Friday evening, Mrs. Pierce's son arrived from Santa Fe. He came with his wife and their 3 young children, having sent a letter of notice that had somehow traveled more slowly than they had, and he arrived to find his mother committed to standing in a church at 10 the following morning, rather than minding the grandchildren. He had specifically mentioned needing assistance, while he went to a business meeting in a town 40 miles east. The conversation between Mrs. Pierce and her son lasted through dinner and into the night, and Etta, who could hear the low urgency of it through the boarding house walls without making out the words, did not sleep particularly well. At breakfast, Mrs. Pierce found her in the dining room and sat across from her with an expression of such genuine distress that Etta felt more concern for the older woman than for herself. "My daughter-in-law is unwell," Mrs. Pierce said. "She has been sick in the night and the children are frantic, and my son, he does not mean badly. He never means badly, but he is frightened for her and I am the only—" She stopped and pressed her lips together. "I am so dreadfully sorry, Etta." Etta reached across the table and took Mrs. Pierce's hand. "Take care of your family," she said. "That is what you must do. That is the right thing." She meant it. She also, quietly and privately, felt the particular tightening in her chest that comes when a thing you have been looking forward to with the whole of your heart seems to be unraveling by small, unstoppable degrees. The wedding was in 4 hours. Grant came to the boarding house at 8 o'clock and found her on the porch. He took one look at her face and sat down beside her. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she loved most about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who else do we know?" It was such an entirely practical, forward-looking thing to say that she felt some of the tightening in her chest ease. "Everyone in this town," she said. "Then we'll ask," he said. "We have 4 hours. Let's walk." They walked Main Street together that Saturday morning of August in 1882, and they asked everyone they found. Hank Alderman, who ran the saloon and had known Grant since his first week in Callow Creek, said yes with the wholehearted sincerity of a man who owed Grant a debt. Grant had once talked a particularly aggressive drunk out of taking Hank's counter apart board by board, but Hank's delivery wagon had arrived that very morning with a shipment of whiskey that had been sitting in the August sun for 2 days and was showing signs of having gone seriously wrong. And the delivery driver was already threatening to leave without unloading if someone didn't resolve the situation immediately. And Hank was, as he put it with great apology, the only person standing between the delivery and a genuine catastrophe involving 40 gallons of bad spirits. Doc Ellis would have come, but he had a patient, a ranch hand who had come in that morning with a hand badly cut by a fence wire, and who had waited longer than he should have, and he could not in good conscience leave the man mid-treatment. Me, the elderly widow from across the street, wanted desperately to come, but could not walk the distance to the chapel on her arthritic knees, and the morning was already too warm for the journey to be safe. Reverend Hollowell's requirement echoed in Etta's mind. Inside this building before the ceremony begins. She and Grant stood in front of the general store at 9:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before their ceremony, and looked at each other. "I'm not worried," Grant said, and she could tell he meant it. "I'm not worried either," she said, which was perhaps 60% true, "but I am going to go to the chapel and speak to Reverend Hollowell." "I'll come with you," he said. "You should not see me before the ceremony," she said. "That is one tradition I will keep even now." He looked at her for a moment, and then something moved through his expression, that warmth in the deep-water gray, and he said, "Go. I'll be there at 10. She walked to the chapel. Reverend Hollowell was arranging the altar cloth when she came in, moving with the particular focused calm of a man performing a familiar and meaningful ritual. He looked up and saw her face and set down the cloth. She explained. He listened with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. "I understand the circumstances," he said when she had finished, "and I want to say clearly that my heart goes out to you. But I must be equally clear. I cannot perform this ceremony without a witness in this building. It is not a tradition I observe casually. It is a principle I hold to with care, for reasons I explained to you at our first meeting." "I know," Etta said, "and I respect it." "I do. Then what do you intend?" the Reverend asked. "I intend to wait," Etta said, "and I believe someone will come." The Reverend looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to admire stubborn faith while also knowing the practical limits of things. 10 o'clock, he said. "I will wait until 10 o'clock. "That is generous," Etta said. "Thank you, Reverend." She sat in the front pew of the small, whitewashed chapel and folded her hands in her lap and watched the light come through the plain glass windows. Callow Creek had not yet acquired stained glass and cast warm rectangles across the wooden floor. She was wearing the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that was perhaps slightly too warm for August, but which was the finest thing she possessed, and which she had pressed with particular care the night before. Her hair was arranged as neatly as she could manage it, pinned at the nape of her neck with the pair of tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her. She had no flowers because she had not thought to arrange for them, and she found she did not mind. She had not come to this town for ceremony. She had come for the real thing, and the real thing was waiting outside in the street. At 5 minutes to 10, the chapel door opened. It was Ezra Colton. 11 years old, serious-faced in his Sunday clothes, holding his hat against his chest with both hands. He stopped just inside the door and looked at Etta in the pew and then at the reverend. "My pa heard Miss Gentry needs a witness," he said with the careful pronunciation of someone who has practiced this sentence. "He's coming. He said to tell her he's coming right now and she shouldn't worry." Etta looked at the child and felt her throat tighten. "Thank you, Ezra," she said. Ezra nodded once, with the gravity of a boy carrying an important message, and stepped back outside. At 3 minutes to 10, Jim Colton walked through the chapel door. Jim Colton ran the small cattle operation east of town, a compact, weather-browned man in his mid-40s who attended Sunday services irregularly and kept mostly to himself, but whose son Ezra was one of Etta's best and most earnest students. He came in with his hat already in his hand and a clean shirt on that still showed the fold marks of being recently removed from storage. "Miss Gentry," he said. "Grant." He nodded to the reverend. "I'll stand as witness if you'll have me." "Mr. Colton," Etta said, standing from the pew, "I will absolutely have you, and I am grateful past what I can properly say." "Ezra thinks the world of you," Jim Colton said simply, as if that explained the whole of it. Figured that was enough. Reverend Hollowell opened his mouth, and then the chapel door opened again. It was Lou Dunbar. She was on a pair of crutches that had clearly been improvised from 2 pieces of fence post and some leather binding, and she was moving with the determined, swinging efficiency of a woman who has decided that a broken ankle is a logistical inconvenience rather than an actual impediment. Behind her, her husband Ned, a quiet man who had been so thoroughly overshadowed by his wife's personality for 20 years that most of the town had nearly forgotten he existed, hovered with his hands slightly extended in the manner of a man ready to catch someone. "I am here," Lou announced to the chapel interior. "I was coming if I had to be carried. I told Ned that. I said, Ned, you carry me if you have to, because Etta Gentry is getting married today and I am going to be there." "You are here," Etta said, and her voice had gone quite unsteady. "Lou, you should be resting your ankle." "My ankle can rest on Sunday," Lou said, settling herself with considerable dignity into the second pew. "Move along, Reverend. We're ready." The Reverend opened his mouth again, and the door opened a third time. It was Tom Briggs. He was dusty from the road, and his horse was still tied at the rail outside, and he had ridden through the night, apparently, to be here. He had 2 of his 4 cattle back. He would explain later, and had turned the rest of the negotiation over to his hired man, with the conviction that some things were more important than cattle. He stood in the doorway, breathing slightly hard from the exertion of getting here, looking at Etta, and said, "Tell me I'm not too late." "You are not too late," Etta said. "Good," Tom Briggs said, and sat down in the pew beside Lou with the solidity of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. And then the door opened a 4th time. Clara Briggs, 12 years old, came in with a fistful of wildflowers, the Tuesday wildflowers, delivered on a Saturday because the occasion demanded it. And behind her came her mother, Martha Briggs, who had not been asked but had heard the whole story from Clara and had decided that if Tom was going, she was going. And if she was going, she was bringing the flowers. And if she was bringing flowers, she was bringing Clara. Reverend Hollowell looked at the growing congregation with the expression of a man whose plans have been overtaken by events, but who is, on some deep level, not entirely displeased by this. And then the door opened a 5th time. This time it was Hank Alderman. The delivery situation had been resolved. Someone had apparently told Hank's barkeep what was happening, and the barkeep had taken over the crisis with the cheerful competence of a man who had been managing crises since before Hank arrived. And Hank had walked the length of Main Street to the chapel because, as he said, settling himself into the pew with the comfortable authority of a man in his own establishment. No man misses a friend's wedding if he can help it. Grant Townsend has been a good neighbor and a good man, and I am here." Word, it appeared, had gotten out. The door opened again, and it was the two young hands from the Pierce ranch, not Mrs. Pierce's boarding house. A different Pierce entirely. A rancher named Walt Pierce whose spread sat 3 miles south, who had been riding past the church when someone called out that the teacher was getting married, and they hadn't had any plans for the morning, so here they were. The door opened again. It was Martha Colton, Jim's wife, who had followed her husband and son from their farm at a slightly slower pace, but had arrived in time to sit beside Jim with her hands folded and a quiet, warm expression on her face. The door opened, and it was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Reed who had shod horses for Grant for 3 years and who arrived without explanation, and sat in the back pew with the air of someone attending a community event of clear importance. The door opened, and it was 2 of the older boys from Etta's school, 15 and 16, respectively, and technically on summer break but clearly monitoring the situation, who squeezed into the back pew beside Reed with barely suppressed excitement. The door opened, and it was Mrs. Pierce herself, who had left her daughter-in-law in the care of her son and her son in the care of God, and had walked the length of Main Street with her good blue dress on because, as she said in the quiet, definitive tone of a woman who has made a decision, she had promised to be here, and she was here. The door opened. The door opened again. The door opened a dozen more times over the next 10 minutes, until the small whitewashed chapel of Reverend Cyrus Hollowell was so thoroughly filled with the people of Callow Creek, New Mexico territory, that several of the later arrivals were standing along the walls and the youngest children were seated on the floor in the aisle, and the morning light came through the plain glass windows and fell across every face. Doc Ellis arrived last, his patient's hand properly wrapped, and the man himself deposited with stern instructions at the saloon with a cup of strong coffee, and he took a standing position near the door with his bag still under his arm. Grant was standing at the front of the chapel when Etta finally walked up the aisle. No music, no particular formality, just the 2 of them and the full, attentive, warm-eyed congregation of their town, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not surprise, because she had told him her faith that someone would come. Not relief, because relief implies doubt. What it was, she decided, was recognition, the same thing she felt looking at him. The sense of a person who has found, specifically and correctly, the place and the one they belong to. Reverend Hollowell, who was not a demonstrative man, looked out at the chapel full of people and was quiet for a moment in a way that Etta thought might have contained some emotion, carefully handled. "I have never," he said at last, "performed a wedding with this many witnesses in attendance." "I believe," Lou Dunbar said from the second pew with considerable satisfaction, "that you said you required a witness inside the building. You did not specify a number." Several people laughed. Even the Reverend's mouth moved. He opened his book. The ceremony was simple. The Reverend was a man of procedure but not of excess, and the vows were the vows as they had been written and as they were meant. Grant took Etta's hands and looked at her with the steady, deep-water gray certainty that she had come to know as the truest thing about him, and she looked back at him with everything she was and everything she had come to this town hoping to become, and they spoke the words that turned 2 people into one life. When the Reverend said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," and Grant kissed her in the whitewashed chapel in front of the entire population of Callow Creek, the sound that went through the building was not polite applause but something fuller and warmer than that, the sound of a community witnessing a thing it had collectively decided to show up for, and being glad it had. Clara Briggs thrust the wildflowers at Etta with an expression of complete triumph. Lou Dunbar was weeping without embarrassment. Tom Briggs shook Grant's hand with both of his. Jim Colton stood quietly in the aisle with his hat in his hands and his son beside him, and when Etta reached him on the way out she took his hand and held it for a moment and said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Colton. Truly." And Jim Colton, who was not a man who showed feeling easily, nodded once and pressed her hand briefly and said, "Ezra picked well when he picked his teacher," which Etta thought was one of the finest things anyone had ever said to her. They emerged from the chapel into the August sunlight to find that the people of Callow Creek had not entirely finished celebrating on their behalf. Lou, from somewhere within the community, had organized, possibly through Ned, possibly through sheer force of will transmitted at a distance, a gathering at the far end of Main Street, and tables had been brought out and someone had contributed a ham, and someone else had contributed 3 pies, and the 2 young hands from the Pierce Ranch, who had nothing else to do on a Saturday morning, had set up a fiddle and a second instrument that might have been a battered concertina, and were playing with modest skill and considerable enthusiasm. It was not a grand affair. It was a Callow Creek affair, which meant it was warm and loud and full of the specific texture of a community that has decided to be happy together. And Etta stood in the middle of it with Grant's hand in hers, and the wildflowers from Clara Briggs clutched in her other hand, and looked around at all these faces, the people she had known for 4 months, which was somehow long enough to matter completely, and felt something settle in her so fully and finally that she could not imagine it ever being unsettled again. She danced with Grant on the dusty street to the fiddle music, which was not something she had expected to do on her wedding day, but which turned out to be one of the best parts of it. He was not a practiced dancer, she was not either, but they moved together with the natural ease that had characterized everything between them from the beginning, and the late morning light lay across the street in the particular warm gold of August in the high desert, and she laughed against his shoulder, and he tucked her closer. "I told you someone would come," she said. "You told me," he agreed. "You were somewhat optimistic about the number." "I was exactly right about the number," she said. The number was enough. The celebration went on into the afternoon, because there was food enough and the day was warm enough, and no one in Callow Creek seemed to have anywhere more important to be. Even Mrs. Pierce made it, settled into a chair that someone had thoughtfully positioned in the shade, watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a woman who has hosted someone worth hosting. Doc Ellis, who stayed well into the afternoon and drank 2 cups of coffee and half a slice of apple pie, cornered Grant at one point near the edge of the gathering, and said with the direct simplicity of a man who wasted very little on preamble, "You take good care of her. She's one of the best people in this town and she's been through enough." "I know it," Grant said. "I intend to." Doc Ellis nodded once, with the air of a man filing a satisfactory report, and went back to his pie. They moved into Grant's house that evening. He had been sleeping in a small room at the back of the livery while finishing the house, which was complete now, or complete enough, with the bedroom properly done and the kitchen functional and the front room still smelling of new wood. And Etta walked through the 3 rooms in the early evening light, and ran her hand along the wooden window sill he had cut and fitted himself, and looked at the view through the front window, which was of the street, and past it. The mesa turning dark rose in the sunset. "I am going to put books on that wall," she said, indicating the broad plank wall beside the fireplace. "I built the shelves for it last week," he said from behind her. She turned. The shelves were there, she had not seen them in the evening shadow, 3 long, solid shelves of good pine, sanded smooth, fixed to the wall with the same careful workmanship as everything he built. She looked at them for a long moment and then looked at him. "Grant Townsend," she said. "Etta Townsend," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, her name, her new name, the name she had just taken, that made it sound like the opening line of a story rather than the closing of one. She crossed the room and kissed him, and the mesa outside the window went from rose to deep violet to the dark blue of a desert night, and the first stars came out over Callow Creek, and the street below was quiet with the particular quiet of a town that has spent a good day and is ready for what comes next. The school year started again in September, and Etta returned to the schoolhouse with 20 students now instead of 14, because word had spread to several of the ranch families on the edges of the valley that the school was worth the ride, and 4 children from the Pierce Ranch started attending, along with 2 from a family named Garza who had come north from the southern reaches of the territory to work a farm plot near the creek. The Garza children, a boy of 9 named Tomás and a girl of 7 named Rosario, spoke limited English and considerably more Spanish than most of the other children in the school. And Etta, who had grown up in San Antonio and spoke Spanish with the particular fluency of someone who had learned it alongside English rather than after it, threw herself into the double-language classroom with a thoroughness that made even some of the established families take notice. Some people in town raised questions about the arrangement, not cruelly, but in the way people who have not thought carefully about a thing ask questions that reveal more about their assumptions than their intentions. One man, a rancher who had recently moved to the valley from further east, came to the schoolhouse at the end of a school day in early October and stood in the doorway, and said that he had heard the teacher was running Spanish lessons for the Mexican children, and he wasn't sure what he thought about that. Etta looked at him calmly, with the chalkboard behind her still bearing the arithmetic lesson of the day and the schoolroom smelling of chalk dust and the cedar wood of the new benches and the particular sweetness of apple cores from the noon break. "I am teaching all children to read and cipher," she said, "in whatever language helps them get there fastest so they can learn the rest. Tomás and Rosario Garza are bright children who deserve the same education as every other child in this room. That is what I am doing and what I will continue to do." The man looked at her for a moment. She did not flinch. He left without further comment. He sent his own son to the school the following week. Grant heard about the exchange from Tom Briggs, who had heard it from someone who had been nearby, and he came home that evening and found Etta at the front room table with lesson books spread around her, and he set a cup of coffee beside her elbow without interrupting, and when she looked up, he was simply looking at her with that particular warmth in his gray eyes. "I heard you held your ground," he said. "It was not complicated," she said. "No," he agreed, "but not everyone would have." She thought about it for a moment. "My mother raised me in a neighborhood in San Antonio where the families were mostly Mexican and mestiz, and some of them were very poor, and some of them were treated very badly because of both those things," she said. "She was a seamstress who made the same clothes for wealthy women who never thought about her name. I have never been able to be comfortable with the idea that where someone comes from makes them worth less. It seems like the simplest possible moral arithmetic." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Etta, I want you to know that I married you for a great many reasons, and what I just heard about today is one of them." She looked at him. He was entirely serious. "Go on and finish your lessons," he said, and went to see to something in the kitchen, and she looked back at her lesson books with a feeling in her chest that was specifically and permanently happiness. The autumn that came to Callow Creek in 1882 was long and warm and golden, the kind of autumn that seems like a gift the land is giving before the hard work of winter begins. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned brilliant yellow and dropped their leaves in drifts that the children kicked through on their walks to school, and the mesas in the evening light went through a succession of colors that Etta tried to describe in letters to a friend back in San Antonio, and found that language was simply insufficient. She and Grant settled into the life they had each separately been, in one way or another, building toward without knowing it. He worked the livery with the steady, reliable competence that had made it the best-maintained stable in 2 valley towns. She taught and planned, and continued the quiet, determined work of educating the children of the valley, without making distinctions that the territory itself often insisted on making. In the evenings they sat by the fireplace as the nights grew cooler, and she read and he worked on the accounts or occasionally on small carpentry projects for the house, and they talked easily about the day and about the future and about everything and nothing, with the particular rich comfort of people who have found in each other a companion for all varieties of time, not only the exciting ones. In November, Etta told Grant she was going to have a child. She told him on a Sunday evening when the fire was going and the wind was making its cold, exploratory passes at the window glass and the street outside was quiet. She had known for perhaps 3 weeks and had kept the knowledge close, turning it over, understanding it, making sure of what she was sure of before she spoke. This was simply how she did things. She said it directly, which was also simply how she did things. "Grant, I am expecting a child." He looked up from the account book he had been reviewing. The expression that moved through his face was not something she could fully describe then or ever precisely, but it was the truest thing she had seen in a very long time, a kind of joy that had not yet found its shape, spilling out before it could be contained or composed. He set the account book on the floor and reached across and took her hands and held them and said nothing for a moment, looking at her with his full, careful attention. "When?" he said. "Summer," she said. "June, most likely." He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there. His eyes above her fingers were bright. "June," he said against her hands. "June," she confirmed, and the fire snapped in the hearth, and outside the desert wind moved over the mesas and past the whitewashed chapel and down Main Street and against their window, and inside the house on the north end of Callow Creek, Etta Townsend, who had come to this territory with a saddlebag and a worn Bible and the specific kind of hope that doesn't know yet what it's hoping for, felt that hope resolve into something fully, solidly real. She continued teaching through the winter because the school needed her, and because she was perfectly well and saw no reason to stop, and because she was, at her core, not the kind of person who stopped something she loved because of circumstance. The children figured it out in February, the way children figure things out, through a combination of observation and the frank conversational habits of a community where news traveled fast. Clara Briggs brought extra wildflowers for the rest of the winter, even though there weren't any growing yet, which meant she was bringing dried ones from wherever she stored last season's, which Etta found so touching she put them in the jar on her desk beside the geography primer. Ezra Colton, who was now 12 and had developed the beginnings of the serious, measured quality that would make him quite a remarkable person eventually, said to her one afternoon in March when the other children had gone and he was helping stack the primers at the end of the day, "Miss Gentry, Mrs. Townsend, I just want to say that I think it's good. That you're having a baby. I think that's good." "Thank you, Ezra," she said. He nodded in his way and carried the primers to the shelf. Lou Dunbar, fully recovered from the broken ankle by January and returned to her post behind the general store counter with renewed authority, organized a gathering in February that she called a small welcoming celebration for the new child, which turned out to be attended by essentially the same number of people as the wedding. Grant came and stood in the general store surrounded by women who had brought gifts for a child not yet born, and who were explaining to him the uses of various textile items with the firm clarity of people who believe that a man's education in these matters is never sufficiently complete, and he received all of it with quiet good grace and thanked everyone individually. He was, Etta observed from across the room, a man very much at peace with himself and with his life. This was not a small thing. She had known enough men who were not at peace with themselves to understand its value clearly. Spring came again, her second spring in Callow Creek, and already it felt like something she had always known, the particular smell of the desert going green after the winter rains, and the way the mesas showed fresh color in the long morning light. The school year wound toward its close. She taught her last lessons before summer break in a state of considerable physical discomfort. June was coming quickly, and she had developed the particular ungainliness of a woman in the last weeks of a first pregnancy, but she finished the year. She stood in front of her students on the last day of May and told them what they would study in the fall and how proud she was of what they had done, and watched them file out into the summer day with the particular energy of children released from benevolent captivity. And Clara Briggs hugged her around the middle very carefully, and Ezra Colton shook her hand with great seriousness, and she locked the schoolhouse door and walked home. Their son was born on the 17th of June, 1883, in the bedroom of the house on the north end of Callow Creek, with Doc Ellis in attendance and Lou Dunbar present at the bedside, because Lou had simply arrived, and no one had seen a reason to suggest she leave, and Grant in the hall outside the door in a state of controlled tension that Lou would later describe as the most thoroughly still frightened man she had ever observed. The child was loud and healthy, and had a great deal of dark hair, and eyes that in the first days looked simply dark, but within a week or two were settling into the gray-green of something still being decided. Grant came in when Doc Ellis called him and stood at the bedside and looked at his son and then at Etta with an expression that undid her completely, which she was entirely willing to forgive given the circumstances. "He is very loud," Grant said. "He is perfect," Etta said. "He is both those things," Grant agreed, and sat on the edge of the bed and held his son with the same careful, measuring strength she had felt in his hands since the first day she met him, and looked at the child's face with the particular intensity of a person beginning to learn something new by heart. They named him James William Townsend, James for Grant's father, William for no particular reason except that it seemed to suit him when they said it, which was, they agreed, as good a reason as any. Lou Dunbar declared the name excellent and went home to make soup. James grew with the vigorous, opinionated energy of a boy who has decided that the world is fundamentally interesting and intends to investigate it thoroughly. He walked at 11 months. He talked or began the process that would eventually produce talking, via a lengthy and enthusiastic intermediate stage of emphatic pointing and decisive vocalization, by the time he was a year old. He had Grant's steady temperament overlaid with Etta's curiosity, which produced a combination that was simultaneously the easiest and most thoroughly engaged child that either of his parents had expected. Etta returned to teaching in September, with James in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom for the first 2 months, which the children received as the most extraordinary educational development since the geography primer, and which James appeared to enjoy enormously, since it gave him a constant audience. By November, he had been handed off to Mrs. Pierce for morning childminding while Etta taught, an arrangement Mrs. Pierce had proposed herself, and which she implemented with the thoroughness of a woman who had not had a satisfying project in some time. The years moved through Callow Creek with the particular pace of a place that is growing but growing at a human rate, where you can watch the change accumulating brick by brick and roof by roof, and know the name of every person responsible for every change. The school grew to 25 students and then to 30. Grant expanded the livery. The second barn went up in the spring of 1884 with the help of half the men in town, in the way that building projects happened in the territory, as a community event with a shared noon meal and a satisfying degree of accomplished chaos. Jim Colton, who had come to the wedding on the word of his son's faith in his teacher, became a more regular presence in town life. He was a quietly capable man who had kept mostly to himself before, and Etta had noticed that some of that withdrawal seemed to be grief. He had lost a first child before Ezra, a daughter, in infancy, and the sorrow of it had shaped the way he held himself in the world. He started attending Sunday services more regularly. He and Grant developed the kind of friendship that men of similar temperament build carefully, over time, through practical cooperation and shared work rather than declaration. And by the summer of 1884 Jim Colton was as regular a figure at the Townsend house on Sunday evenings as the sun set. Ezra, 13 now, had turned into the serious, measured young person Etta had seen the potential for a boy who read everything he could get his hands on and who had begun, quietly and without making much of it, to help the younger Garza children with their language work in the schoolroom during the noon break, simply because he had noticed they needed it, and he was capable of providing it. Etta noticed and said nothing, because she knew that some things you let grow in silence, or you risk the cold air ruining them. The winter of 1884 was harder than the previous two, and Callow Creek pulled together in the way of small communities facing difficulty, sharing resources, and labor with the pragmatic warmth of people who understand that in a hard country, looking after each other is not charity but sense. Etta organized a school supply effort for the two ranch families who were struggling most that winter, framing it around the practical educational needs of the children, so as to preserve the dignity of people who would have found direct charity difficult to accept. Grant contributed quietly and extensively to the effort, and when Etta thanked him he looked mildly puzzled, as if he could not quite understand what there was to thank him for. "It is simply what you do," he said. "It is what you do," she said. "Not everyone." He thought about that for a moment with the seriousness he gave to things that required it. "Then more people should," he said, and went back to what he had been doing. Their daughter was born in March of 1885. They named her Clara, partly for the small girl who had been bringing wildflowers since the beginning, and partly because it was simply a name that felt right in the mouth, clear and bright, like the sound of a bell. Clara Townsend arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected and with considerable speed, in a manner that left everyone slightly breathless, and she seemed from the first to regard the world around her as a series of stimulating puzzles, reaching for everything with small, decisive hands, and regarding faces with the focused attention of someone taking notes. James, who was almost 2, examined his sister with the careful interest of a scientist reviewing new data, and pronounced her small but loud, which Etta thought showed both observation and fairness. Lou Dunbar, at the announcement, arrived with soup even before she had been called, which suggested a level of advanced preparation that Etta found both slightly unnerving and deeply comforting. Life in the Townsend house on the north end of Callow Creek had a texture to it that Etta sometimes tried to describe to herself in the moment's evening firelight, early morning coffee, Sunday rides on the Mesa Trail with James on a small pony Grant had acquired for the purpose, and Clara in front of Grant on the saddle, moments that felt so specifically right that she wanted to press them into her memory the way she pressed flowers into books, to keep the exact shape of them. Grant was the father she had hoped he would be, which was to say that he was present and steady and paid attention. He taught James the livery with the same patient instruction he had given Etta that first April day, answering every question with the seriousness it deserved and never treating the questions of a 2-year-old, and then a 3-year-old, and then a 4-year-old, as being less worthy of a full answer than the questions of an adult. Clara he treated from the first with the same level of engaged respect, and Etta watched this and felt a warmth in her chest that was specifically about who he was, not who he performed to be, but who he simply was in the ordinary days, in the unremarkable moments where a person shows you their actual character. She had one conversation with him about it, one of their late evening conversations by the fireplace when both children were asleep, and the house held the specific quiet of a family's night that she would remember always. She had been telling him about something one of the children had said that day. She could not remember later which child or what they had said, and he had listened and laughed in the quiet way he laughed, and she had stopped and looked at him. "What?" he said. "I am just happy," she said. "I wanted to say it directly. I know I say it sometimes in other ways, but I wanted to say it plainly. I am happy, Grant. Specifically, particularly, completely happy." He looked at her across the firelight with the deep-water gray eyes she had been reading now for 3 years and knew as well as she knew anything in the world. "So am I," he said. "Etta, so am I." The years passed in the way that good years pass, not slowly, not quickly, but with the quality of richness, each day containing enough to be worth remembering. James started school the September he turned 5, which meant going to his mother's classroom, which was a development he seemed to consider both entirely natural and significantly exciting. He was, Etta was not particularly surprised to discover, an excellent student. He had her relentlessness and Grant's patience, which was a useful combination, and he was kind to the younger children in the way that children are kind when they have been shown kindness as the natural mode of operation. Callow Creek grew. A new family built a house 2 streets south of the Townsend house. The general store expanded, and a separate post office was established, which relieved Lou Dunbar of the postmaster function, but did not remotely diminish her information network, which operated through channels that did not require official postal access. The chapel was extended. Reverend Hollowell presided over the expansion with the same careful seriousness with which he presided over everything, and Grant led the volunteer work crew, and it was done by the spring of 1886 with new benches that matched the old ones and a front door that actually closed properly in the winter wind. Doc Ellis's eyesight was failing slightly by 1886, and he had begun writing to the Territory Medical Association about a younger physician to assist him. And in the spring, a young man named Dr. Samuel Park arrived from the East with his medical degree and his own set of tools, and an expression of someone who had prepared thoroughly for the frontier, and was finding that preparation was not quite the same as the thing. Etta took him in hand socially, in the understated way she had of doing things, inviting him to Sunday dinner, introducing him to the families he would need to know, making sure he understood the social geography of the valley as well as the physical one. And within 2 months, he was functioning as a member of the community rather than an arrival. Dr. Park was 26, serious and quietly observant, and he had a habit of reading medical journals in the saloon during quiet hours, which Hank Alderman initially regarded with some bemusement, and then accepted with the same philosophical ease he extended to most things. He met Martha Colton's younger sister, a woman named Ruth who had come to stay for a summer, at Sunday services in July of 1886, and he and Ruth had the kind of conversation that goes on significantly longer than either party was expecting, and then several more conversations of that nature. And by September, when Ruth was supposed to go back to her home in Colorado, neither of them wanted her to. Etta saw all of this with the recognition of someone who has lived it. She said nothing directly, but she did, one evening at Sunday dinner with the Coltons and Dr. Park both present, arranged the seating so that Ruth and Samuel were next to each other, and she watched the evening unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has set a small, well-considered thing in motion. Ruth stayed in Callow Creek. She and Dr. Park were married the following April, with Reverend Hollowell officiating, and the chapel was again full of people who had simply decided to be there. Ezra Colton, now 15, stood as one of the formal witnesses with the gravity of a young man who takes the weight of things seriously and understands what he is attesting to. Lou Dunbar sat in her usual second pew, and this time did not cry, or claimed not to, though the evidence against this claim was considerable. At the reception that followed, Etta stood with Grant at the edge of the gathering, the same end of Main Street where their own reception had been, with fiddle music and the afternoon sun on the red mesa, and she thought about April of 1882, when she had ridden into this valley with nothing but a saddlebag and a worn Bible, and the kind of hope she had not yet found a name for. She had a name for it now. She had several names for it. They were James and Clara and Grant and this town and these people and this life, built steadily and honestly from the ground up, the way he built things and the way she taught things, with patience and attention and the belief that what you put into something comes back to you in kind. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked beside her. "That I am glad I came here," she said. "So am I," he said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the warm April light and watched their friends dance on the dusty main street of Callow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1887. And the mesas in the distance held their particular ancient calm, and above them the sky was the deep, particular blue of a place where everything is wide open, and the distance goes on as far as you can see. James, who was 4 now and had developed a passionate interest in horses that showed every sign of being permanent, broke free of whatever supervision he had been under and ran to his father, and climbed onto Grant's back with the practiced ease of a child accustomed to that elevation. And Grant lifted him easily and held him against his side, and the three of them stood together, Etta and Grant and their son, while Clara was somewhere in Lou Dunbar's arms, being exclaimed over, which Clara seemed to find entirely satisfactory. Tom Briggs appeared at Etta's elbow with 2 cups of lemonade and pressed one into her hand with the air of a man fulfilling a duty. "To the bride and the town," he said, raising his. "To the town," Etta agreed, and meant it in all the ways it could be meant. The evening of the park wedding, when they had walked home and put the children to bed and settled in the front room by the fire, it was April still and the desert nights ran cold. Etta reached for Grant's hand in the firelight and held it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about the schoolhouse," she said. "About expanding the program. I've been writing to the Territory Education Board about getting more books and adding a proper reading curriculum for the older students. Ezra is past what I can give him with what we have, and in 2 or 3 years there will be others like him. I want to build something here that will last past me, past this particular year. A real school, Grant, not just a building." He looked at her for a moment with full attention. "What do you need?" "Support from the town council," she said. "Better books. Maybe another teacher in a few years for the older students. It will take time and convincing, and I will have to write a great many letters." "Then you should start," he said, as if it were the simplest thing. "You have always known what you were building. Start." She looked at him. "You make things sound very straightforward." "Some things are," he said. "You came to this town to build something worth building. That hasn't changed. Nothing about you has changed except that you have more of what you needed then. Start writing your letters." She squeezed his hand. "I already started," she said. He laughed, really laughed, which he did rarely enough that it was always a specific gift when it came, and she laughed with him, and the fire settled in the hearth and the desert night moved over the valley outside, and the town of Callow Creek lay quiet and full under the enormous southwestern sky, every house lit with the small, particular light of its own life. 2 years later, in the spring of 1889, the Callow Creek School received its first official territorial designation as a multi-level educational institution, with a grant of books and materials from the Territory Education Board that required 3 supply wagons to deliver. Etta hired a second teacher, a young woman from Albuquerque named Patience Howard, who was 22 and earnest and considerably better at mathematics than Etta, which was a quality Etta identified and immediately exploited, and the school expanded into a second room that the men of the town built over a long weekend in March. With Grant and Tom Briggs and Jim Colton and Hank Alderman all present, and the whole thing accomplished with the usual community event combination of purpose and cheerful argument over the proper technique for setting a window frame. Ezra Colton, now 18, had already begun corresponding with a college in New Mexico that was accepting the first classes of territory students. He came to tell Etta and Grant at their Sunday dinner table in November of 1889, sitting straight in his chair with his hands flat on the table, and his face carrying the controlled excitement of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a thing out loud. "I've been accepted," he said, "for next fall." Etta set down her spoon. She looked at him, this boy who had refused to read aloud in April of 1882, and who was now sitting at her table with a letter of college acceptance, and the serious, precise character of someone who has been building himself with the same care and purpose as any of the things the men of this town had built with their hands. "Ezra," she said, with a fullness in her voice that she did not attempt to contain, "I am so proud of you." "You made it possible," he said, with the directness of someone who states facts. "You made it possible," she said. "I just held the door." He shook his head slightly. He had his father's quality of quiet certainty. "You held a lot of doors," he said. "I know the difference between a person who holds doors and a person who doesn't." Grant raised his coffee cup across the table. "To Ezra Colton," he said. They all raised their cups. "James, who was 6 and had recently decided that being included in adult toast was one of his inalienable rights, raised his glass of water with great seriousness. And the fire was going, and the evening was warm, and the Callow Creek school had sent its first student to college, which felt, to Etta, like exactly the thing she had come to this valley to do. There were hard years within the good ones, because that is how years work. A drought in the early months of 1888 that lasted long enough to make everyone tighten their belts and their expectations. And Grant and Jim Colton organized the water-sharing agreement among the ranch families that got everyone through it without catastrophe, though not without difficulty. A fire at the eastern end of Main Street in the summer of 1890 that took out the old warehouse building and threatened 2 neighboring structures before the bucket chain organized by essentially the entire adult population of the town stopped it. Everyone was there, everyone contributed, and nobody was seriously hurt, which felt like an adequate outcome given what it might have been. The children grew in the way that children grow when they are loved and watched and given space, fully, specifically, into themselves. James was 8 in June of 1891 and had the horses in his blood as deeply as his father and perhaps more, spending every free morning at the livery and acquiring a knowledge of equine character that exceeded what most grown men in the valley possessed. Clara was 6 and had Etta's determined precision and something else, a quality of artistic attention, a way of looking at things that produced drawings of the mesa and the creek and the main street that Tom Briggs's wife had started framing and putting on walls. The third child, they had not been expecting a third, or had not been specifically expecting, but also had not been not expecting, arrived in October of 1892. Another boy, darker than James, with Etta's deep brown eyes and Grant's quiet attentiveness from the first days, who examined the world around him with a steady, curious calm that made Doc Ellis, who was now considerably less active but who had been present for all 3 of the Townsend births and intended to be present for as many as biology and time allowed, say that the boy was going to be a thinker. They named him Henry. Henry James Park, actually, Dr. Samuel Park had delivered this one, with Doc Ellis watching with proprietary interest from the corner, and the name came partly from Grant's maternal grandfather, and partly because it simply fit him, the same way William had fit James, the right name finding the right person. Lou Dunbar arrived with soup before the announcement had technically been made, which at this point no one in the Townsend household found even remotely surprising. On a Sunday evening in November of 1892, 10 years to the month after Etta Gentry had ridden into Callow Creek on a bay mare with a saddlebag and a worn Bible, and the specific, unnamed hope that had turned out to be for all of this. Grant Townsend sat on the front porch of the house on the north end of Main Street with his wife beside him and the mesa glowing the last of the day's red in the distance, and James was inside reading, and Clara was drawing something at the kitchen table. And Henry was asleep in the bedroom with the particular profound sleep of a 2-month-old who has eaten and is satisfied with the world. The street below them was quiet in the early evening way, a dog moving along the opposite side, the last of the day's horses settling in the livery down the block, the chapel's windows showing the light of Reverend Hollowell's evening lamp as the old Reverend read or wrote, or simply sat in the quiet of the building he had constructed with his own hands, and which had now seen more of this town's life than any other structure on Main Street. Grant reached over and took Etta's hand. She turned to look at him, and he was looking out at the mesa, and then he turned to look at her, and they were both quiet for a moment in the way of people who do not need to fill every silence. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at her. The deep-water gray eyes held everything she knew about him, all of it familiar, all of it still, after 10 years, interesting, because that was the thing about Grant Townsend that she had understood on some level from the first day she looked at him across a livery stall, and that she understood more fully now than she had words for. He was not a simple depth. He was an ongoing one, and she had been exploring it for 10 years and expected to be exploring it for 40 more. "I am thinking," he said, "that you came here on a horse and you stayed." "I stayed," she said. "And everything else," he said, with a gesture that encompassed the house and the street and the mesa and the sky and whatever was behind and beyond all of it, the children inside, the town below, the life they had built here from the ground up out of daily deliberate choices made consistently and with care, came from that. She looked at him for a moment with the fullness of 10 years in her chest. "Not just from that," she said. "From you too, from you in particular." "From both of us then," he said. "From both of us," she agreed. And she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of their house on the north end of Callow Creek, New Mexico territory, in the falling November dusk of 1892, with the mesa going from rose to violet to the dark blue of a desert evening, and the first stars appeared above the valley one by one, and the town below them moved through its quiet, particular life, and they were home.